Before we begin, just giving you an update on our new subscription. It's called Dave McWilliams Plus on Apple. You just double click, you get no ads, and you get me and John, pure and simple.
And Mac, you get early access episodes. Did you know that?
Sure, my day is made. To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time. It's rarely we can say the podcast comes to you from the ancient city of Baalbek, or Helionopolis, as it used to be called by the Greeks and the Romans. We are 7 kilometers from the Syrian border, deep in Hezbollah-held territory in Lebanon. And John, I am seeing a side of the world I have never seen before. An extraordinary
From inside out
place.
the hood.
I've exactly. At least I've seen it now. I might not be seeing it for a while. No, but it is an extraordinary place. The murals up here are all Iranian. The weird thing about Lebanon is when you go into various different sectors and various different ethnic areas, they're announced to you a little bit like West Belfast and East Belfast by murals, right? So, you go to West Belfast and East Belfast, the murals, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Here, driving from the Mediterranean to Syria across the country, you leave Beirut, you go into the Bekaa Valley, very famous neck of the woods, and then you end up on the Syrian border going across. You go over the mountains, through the valley, and then up the mountains again. So you'd go through, for example, if it's a Maronite Christian area, you'll see Maronite Christian, usually generals from the army, big murals.
Yeah.
And then if you go through a Sunni-held area, like Sunni Muslim, you'll see big murals of MBS, Bin Salman, the Saudi prince, because he finances them. And then if you go to the Shia areas, the Hezbollah areas, where you actually see big murals of all the Ayatollahs and the Iranians.
And is the writing in the Shia areas, is that in Farsi or?
No, it's all in Arabic. It's still all in Arabic.
Right.
It's basically, but an extraordinary thing here in the areas that are held by Hezbollah, which is a supporter of Assad in Syria. And also, so too is Putin, a supporter of Assad in Syria. There are massive posters of Putin everywhere along the road to Damascus. It's amazing. Right? Massive support
and then,
of Putin.
So how is the Ukrainian war being reported over there? Is it
I don't know, because I don't speak Arabic, but I mean, I would say...
but you're not getting a feel for it.
Well, they're very, very much of the view, right, here, that there is a profound hypocrisy in the West about the invasion of Ukraine. What they see, for example, is that the West Bank in Palestine down the road is precisely the same as Ukraine. That one country has invaded another country, has occupied another country, and there's all song and dance over Ukraine, and there's not a dicky bird over Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, etc.
Well, they're not wrong, though, either.
And so that's the narrative here. So basically, when you sit down and you chat to people, like, lads in the, I was going to say lads in the local bar, but it's not a bar. So lads in the local coffee shop, right?
Yeah.
And you start talking, and they can speak English, or they speak French very well here in Lebanon. So if it's kind of broken French or English, whatever, they just say, look, we're not Putin supporters. That's not our end game. But what we're looking at is our brothers in Palestine down the road are getting hosed and getting occupied and getting humiliated. And you guys are deciding that the monopoly and humiliation is the Ukrainians, whereas we have been occupied, and they really see themselves as we have been occupied for 50 years. So snap out of it. And
it's a fair point.
It's a very, very fair point. It's a very, very fair point. But so it's fascinating. But Baalbek, where we are, John, right, is the best preserved Roman city in the world. In the world. And nobody knows about it. Very few people know about it.
Yeah.
The Temple of Bacchus here, right, which I have just been in this morning. And the Temple of Bacchus has booze, has women in slinky dresses dancing. These are all images from 2,000 years ago.
Right.
It has even little poppy seeds because they were smoking heroin here. Like, the madness of the place. They were into opium, okay? The Romans were into opium. The Temple of Bacchus is the best preserved Roman temple in the world, because when the Muslims came over and took over this part of the world, took over Baalbek, etc., For some reason, they decided to use the inside of the temple as a cistern, and they filled it with water. And what typically has happened to all these old temples is they were actually knocked down in order to use the brickwork and the stonework for defenses and fortifications.
Right.
So
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
dismantled. That's why we don't have so many ruins. The ruins were actually dismantled, not
Yeah.
least because the Romans, I mean, they built these phenomenal structures. But for some miraculous reason, in Baalbek, the local leaders decided to use the temples and this particular temple as a cistern. So they filled it with water, so they never dismantled it. So it looked
Right.
almost as it was.
But it was party central. So it was like the Tamangos of
It was
its
like
day.
it was like the Sloopies of its day. Yeah, no, it was like the Tamangos where the gang goes. Where does the gang go? Tamangos. So I'm in
Tamangos.
Tamangos. I'm in the Tamangos of the ancient world, John. Reporting. I'm actually waiting for the slow set in Tamangos of the ancient world. I've got knights in white satin here on the board, and we're about to rock and roll. But what it does give you, John, what it does give you, apart from a sense of the complete absurd, which is one of the many characteristics of this podcast, a sense of what early globalization was like. So this
Yeah.
is a center of commerce. Spices were coming from Arabia. Extraordinary stones were coming from Africa. Slaves were coming from all over the world, the Roman world. You have the city of Tyre down the road, one of the most important commercial cities. You know, you have early money, and it really gives you a sense of the vibrancy of the ancient world and the fact that globalization we think is all new, but in actual fact, it's thousands of years old. And it was with that in mind that I think I want to introduce our next guest, because you've been asking me over the last couple of weeks, what the hell is going on in the global economy? There's lots of anxiety around there. Markets are falling.
Absolutely.
People are. So let's talk to somebody who really knows what they're talking about, unlike ourselves. So I want to go to Norway to talk to a fantastic brain, an old friend, a guy called Sony Kapoor. Now, amongst his many, many affiliations, he's the professor of climate, geoeconomics, and finance at the EUI. That's the European University in Florence. Lovely place to be a professor at. He's the CEO of the Nordic Institute of Finance, Technology and Sustainability. He has advised all sorts of governments. He's a all-around good guy, big thinker, innovative thinker. And I can't think of anyone better to actually tie all these dots together than Sony Kapoor. So let's go to Oslo, John, and talk to Sony. Sony, how are you? Good to see you.
Same here. It's very nice to see you again. I am all good, a bit jet lagged, but good.
Great. Now, listen, let's get right into it. Look, if you look at the headlines today, the markets are all over the shop. They've been falling for ages. People think the Fed is behind the curve. They don't know what's going on in inflation. We have obviously the war. We have the elimination of the significantly more risky assets that were all the rage last year. We've got Elon Musk pulling out of Twitter. You've got all sorts of things going on, right? Give me a context of why the world seems to be at such a strange tipping point right now.
Well, so just go back to 2018, and we saw a more moderate version of, sort of shocks in the financial market, and things were not looking so good. And 2019, some of that continued. But what rescued the financial markets, ironically, was Corona and the pandemic. I mean, so in a way, that famous cartoon where the character walks off the cliff, and I think that had already
Wile E.
happened
Coyote, I
before
think, is his name.
Exactly. And that continued. And then Corona happened, and all the central banks went, massive, unprecedented QE, and the cliff just extended a little bit. And now COVID has ended, at least, in macroeconomic terms. And the coyote is falling. So that's basically what's going on. And the reasons are manifold, and perhaps we can sort of discuss them one at a time. So let's disaggregate. It's useful to discuss factors that were already true before Corona, and what else new has happened since Corona and since the Ukraine war. So let's look at the former. Now, particularly if you look at the numbers, I mean, there's just no two ways around it, that the financial markets, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States, have had an absolute party, a rocking party for the past 3 decades or so. With a few blips here and there was the GFC, but every single time, every low was, in retrospect, the buying opportunity. And, buying the dip was a philosophy that got everybody out. And central bank puts, wherein every time the financial markets get dislocated, central banks step in to enact policies, cutting interest rates, quantitative easing, that just push them to new highs. Those were very, very real, right? So effectively, for the past 3 to 4 decades, Western financial markets have generated returns of the order of 6 to 8% year after year across the index. And that has been double the global growth rate, right? Now, you can be a teeny tiny hedge fund and you can generate spectacular returns of 20% in an economy growing at 2% year after year, perhaps forever and ever until the laws of compounding catch up with you. But if you're a large pension fund, if you're the whole financial system, there is no sustainable way of year after year, decade after decade, generating returns that are, twice. I mean, we're not talking, 1% higher, etc., twice or more that of global GDP growth, right? Because at the end of the day, no matter how finance gets dislocated from the real economy, the rates of return have a fundamental link to growth rates. And those links were effectively broken. And those happen for a number of reasons. So the number one reason, of course, was the secular decline in global interest rates, which started with, and there's this whole narrative of, Paul Volcker coming in, raising interest rates. And since then, American and global average interest rates have fallen by an average of about 7% or so over those decades. And what happens when interest rates fall? Because all financial cash flow discounting in valuation uses the risk-free rate as the denominator with added some risk premium. As the rates fell, the value of all financial assets across the world, particularly those in Western markets, be it shares, be it fine wines, be it art, crypto, and of course, very
houses,
important.
and the houses being the big one.
Markets, by far the largest. I mean, people don't, there's a lot of emphasis on stock markets, but housing is by far the world's largest asset class, also the one most implicated in the worst crisis, right?
I always come back to it in this podcast, and I always try to I always try to reinforce in the podcast to everyone that, get the housing market right, and you more or less can figure out and configure where the economy is going from there. Never underestimate the power of leveraged property to catapult an economy northwards or southwards, depending on which way it goes. And that's really one of the story of the last 20 or 30 years, certainly in the West. And look, what you're saying, it's all to do with lower rates, the discount rate falling, just the general buoyancy and effervescence that comes when the asset that you sit on top of your house goes through the roof. You just feel richer. And then you go out and you do things with money that you don't really have.
I couldn't agree more. And maybe, it's worthwhile having a short digression there. So I helped set up the housing finance program at the IMF. Now, if you go to the IMF and you say, hey, let's say I'm a new country, how do I run my central bank? How do I run my fiscal policy? They'll give you a manual, chapter and verse. You go and ask them, how do I set up my housing finance system? And they have nothing particularly intelligent to say. It is so varied from country to country. The Danish covered bond market, the German system, what you guys had in Ireland versus, what happens in the Nordics, right? And of course, the big giants, Freddie, Fannie in the United States and its very particular mortgage system. So there's so much variability. And the only thing we can say with certainty is that if you try and say, hey, which is a country with a model housing market, right? Which doesn't lead to boom and bust, doesn't lead to this ridiculously distorted incentive structures and, large distributive issues, right? Urban versus rural, immigrant versus native,
sure, young versus
renter,
old,
right?
all that stuff. Yeah,
young versus exactly, right? And basically, there is no good answer, right? So my last lecture at the fund on this used the examples of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands as 5 countries that would otherwise rank in the top 10 best governed countries on any list, right? But you look at their housing markets, the degree of distortion, the degree of overvaluation, the degree of badly distorted distributive issues, etc. And basically, they're all screwed. So, what does the Bank of England do if the best macroprudential policy for housing is to relax planning permissions around the greenbelt, right? What does a politician do in the Nordics where house ownership rates are so high and on average older people who vote more often, that the sensible decision to reduce the completely ridiculous valuations would make you instantly unelectable.
Unelectable.
Right? And if you're
It's funny,
essentially,
Sonny, what you've just identified is exactly the same dilemma. If you take those countries, your Nordics and the UK, and you throw them in, I'll offer you Ireland as an even more neurotically weird, screwed up example of precisely the same dilemma. And exactly as you've articulated, what you have is there is no economic textbook in the world which would say we should start from where we are with respect to housing.
Exactly. And the political economy of where we are and from here to get to anywhere sensible is absolutely toxic. So as a politician, you make yourself unelectable. As a central banker, you don't want to oversee, the creation of a downward spiral of, revaluation that will end up in the mother of all financial crises. So they're stuck in these impossible corners, which are, by all economic, financial, political economy and distributive lenses, completely insane. And as one unnamed central banker once told me over dinner, the secret of the Nordic social democratic system is that house prices always go up. If that assumption is taken away, a lot of the facade falls. And it's more true than anybody would care to admit.
Well, I mean, I think that actually gets to the nub of the issue, because if house prices keep going up, as you said, older people with wealth attached to housing will continue to spend, they'll continue to vote very, very centrist, and ultimately, as you said, they will continue to be the sort of the ballast, the democratic ballast of the society. And you screw with that at your peril. But the downside then is younger people pay.
Oh, absolutely. The younger people are going to pay from climate change. They're going to pay from, an increasingly polarized politics. They're going to pay, unless and until you have rich parents, which is how, social mobility. So the problem with sort of the Nordic model is income inequality is compressed, but wealth inequality is getting exacerbated with every passing year. And it creates for countries, including Ireland and the Nordics, which have, necessarily rising immigration and we need people, right? A big additional dilemma of, the new migrants coming in and instantly becoming an underclass because they don't have access to the property ladder. And in places like the United States, where housing taxes are linked to the delivery of local services, it leads to this, very polarizing effect of a separation between good and bad school districts, good and bad infrastructure, etc. And you see rising valuations in one area and stagnating, and often, it's divided along ethnic lines. So housing really is, this is not a podcast about housing, but maybe we should do another one. But it is just such a central issue.
Well, actually, let's park the housing discussion for now, but I think we should come back to it, because what you've described will be very recognizable for most of our listeners, which is, take a country like Ireland, you have falling levels of income inequality coupled with rising levels of wealth inequality. And as you say, an immigrant class that cannot get on that wealth conveyor belt, but also a younger class that equally cannot get on the wealth conveyor belt. And as you point out, an increasing, and again in Ireland, this is a very new thing, an increasing role in society played by inheritance, because we never had rich parents because we were always poor. And now for the first generation, there is a rich,
you had the British aristocracy
lower,
to blame,
upper middle age.
And you can't.
Well, we got rid of them. We got rid of them, right? There was a small revolution,
exactly, right?
and they left.
Yeah.
And it's not that they left willingly; they were kind of nudged to go. Anyway, I'm going to come right back to this housing. Definitely, let's park this. We'll come right back to it. I know people listening will say, "Hold on a second, keep going." Let's park this one, and let's come back in a couple of weeks. Let's focus now just on global markets. And again, why you think right now we're at an inflection point and the next few years won't be anything like the last decade or two.
Excellent. So the first factor we discussed was this secular decline in interest rate. Now, it may be, right, that the present reversal in the direction of perpetually falling interest rates, at least in the United States, might not last, right? I mean, we may see another big recession. Central banks might have to stop raising rates or might cut again.
Yeah.
That may be, right? But even under that scenario, what you will see just arithmetically is the impulse on valuation achieved from interest rates falling from 8%, 7% real to -1%, 2% real can not be replicated from the present levels unless and until you think interest rates are going to sustainably go down to -8%, -9%, right? Real rates,
which ain't going to happen. So we're looking at a new world.
Exactly. So at the best case scenario from the valuation perspective is that rates are sort of lower for longer, right? Which will just keep valuations at a steady level. But that basically means if valuations are at a steady level, that then the returns, the 7-8% you've been expecting and factoring into your pension models, as most US pension funds do, are gone, right? I mean, it'll just deliver steady state. But a much more likely scenario is that rates will rise and, asset prices will fall. So that's the first fact. The second one, which links in particular to, the outperformance of the American stock market and stocks in general, is that global corporate tax rates have fallen by an average of about 20% in these same decades, right? And since, from an investor point of view, what you care about is the free cash flow available for investors after taxes are paid, this has significantly enhanced free cash flows. Now, this corporate tax rate decline has been secular across the board with one or two exceptions here and there. And it applies whether you look at the top line corporate tax rates or global weighted average or just an arithmetic average. In all three cases, the decline is roughly sort of 20%. Now, for a number of reasons. One, the fiscal stresses that were caused by the GFC, and of course now, turbocharged by Corona. There was a serious pressure, the US conservative candidate debate notwithstanding, to raise corporate tax rates. And there's a very strong pressure in a number of countries. And again, it may be that the rise doesn't happen, but what is very certain is that from the present level, further fall of corporate tax rate of 20% is not going to happen.
Yeah,
right?
It's not going to happen. So we've got corporate taxes are going to go up. We've got interest rates are going to go up or at least remain plateauing at this level. I presume we have the end of QE and personally post-corona QE, and that's going to reverse the next. Well, that's in reversal right now.
Absolutely, right. And there again, I think people underestimate the effect of the QE. I mean, depending on when you draw the timeline and which all central banks you take into account, we've had somewhere between $20 to $25 trillion of QE, right? Which is a huge amount of money, equivalent to something like third or fourth of assets under management by pension fund and institutional investors that's been injected into the system, creating new demand. And of course, you put in new buyers into the market and the pool of assets for purchase doesn't expand at the same speed and prices will be bid up. So just to recap, right? So the secular decline in interest rates is at an end, which means it will no longer provide the tailwind for asset price valuations. And if, as we have seen, the Fed raising rates, if some of this rate rise continues, it is going to become a headwind that will push down asset prices further. Second, the secular decline in corporate tax rates has come to an end. And, the OECD BEPS 2.0 global deal on minimum corporate taxation is one of the symptoms. There's been a lot of crackdown on tax havens. And I know, Ireland and the Netherlands, and of course, have been very active part of this debate. And you have played your role in that. And you can feel the pressure from all of the other large G7, G20 economies in the EU to end the particular tax regime you had. So at best, corporate taxes will stay the same, which is highly unlikely, but much more likely scenario is they will start rising, and which means post-tax cash flows available to investors are going to fall, and hence valuations are going to fall. And then number three, somewhere between 20 to 25 trillion dollars of new money created by central banks across the world which bid up the prices of assets across the board, either directly by buying them or indirectly by buying particular assets which investors who sold them went on with the new free cash flows to buy other assets, right? Is again at an end and has started reducing. And, whichever scenario one looks at, we really hope and wish that we don't end up with a scenario where central banks need to inject, another $25 trillion of QE. And again, it's the pace of QE, right? So even if QE doesn't end, right, even if the central bank current stock of assets remains the same, even if, the ECB gets forced into restarting a QE program,
Sure, to bail out
that
the
is,
Italians or the
smaller.
Greeks. Yeah.
Yeah, but even under those scenarios, the scenario where QE would give the size, the speed of tailwind that it has in the past is gone. Far, far more likely it is going to become a headwind. So between these three forces, they all point in one direction, which is asset prices being forced down. And just one last point, folks normally don't realize what massive role these three forces have played in the rise of asset prices. So roughly two-thirds of current market values across a number of asset classes have come not from an increase in the size of cash flows, but because of an increase in valuation. And only one-third has come from an increase in cash flows, right? And if you look at the Norwegian oil fund, if you look at many of the American large pension funds, the Dutch pension funds, etc., somewhere between 60 to 70% of their present assets under management haven't come from cash flows generated by interest rates or dividends, have come from an increase in valuation, right? So the valuation effect has been the dominant factor driving all these headlines in the rising tide of asset prices across the world.
So Sonny, in a nutshell then, what happens next? You've got all these extraordinary supports are falling away. As you say, you have a dislocation in all assets between what we would describe as the legitimate earned valuation and the rented valuation rented from these policy supports. I mean, in a nutshell, what happens next? What do you think happens next? What do people get their heads around? People listen to the podcast who might have pensions and they've been going up, gradually, dumpty, saying, okay, that looks great. Every year they get a little thing that comes through, says, well, you're not doing too bad. And their house prices are increasing. They've made a few investments. They seem to be going well. And of course, the problem with making investments, you think going well, then if you think it's going well, you think it's all down to you. You think you're a genius and you've got the Midas touch and all sort of, right? Where are we going?
Okay, let's separate this into two. So one is, where should we go? And then let's get into Russia, Ukraine, climate, and where we are actually going, right? Which may or may not end up being the two same things. So where should we go, right? So one of the other big forces in this whole scenario was, and all the central bankers were until recently patting themselves on the back, for having got inflation under control and having delivered this, low inflation regime. But we know, I hope a lot of your listeners already know that, central bankers probably had very little to do with the Goldilocks era of inflation that we saw, right?
Absolutely. I know. I mean, God bless them. God bless them with their belief in their own munificence. But I'm with you completely.
Yeah. So between the fall of the Berlin Wall and China's entry into the WTO, the number of workers that were part of Western global supply chains essentially doubled within the period of a decade or so. And that basically meant that the price of labor was bid down and returns on capital, which was the scarce element there, increased significantly. So even in the cash flow, legitimately earned cash flow part of the discussion we were having, the one-third of the valuation increase that is, legitimately driven by increase in profitability and margins, that was mostly not down to the genius of, Western capital markets. What was down to geopolitical terms, China and Central Eastern Europe, right? Now, those impulses have also run their course. And we see across the world, labor asking for its fair share and labor's share of income. And GDP has either fallen or stagnated. And that is, yet another important trend which points in the same direction, right? So the demographic tailwind that we got through these two large geopolitical phenomena has also run its course. Now, let's look south and let's look east. Let's look at India and let's look at Nigeria. In the next 20 to 30 years, the population of Nigeria will be bigger than the population of the European Union, right?
In the next 20 years. In the next 20
to
years.
30, I forgot. Is it 20? Okay, yeah.
No. But next 20 to 30 years, because I read something that there were more babies born in Nigeria about 4 years ago than the entire European landmass, plus the islands, i.e. going from Ireland all the way to Vladivostok, if you include that part of Russia in Europe. There were more babies born in Nigeria in 1 year than in this entire geographical area. So the implications of that is very, very soon the Nigerian population ends up being bigger than Europe's, which is a phenomenal thing to get your head around.
Yeah, and India's is already 1.4 billion, right? I mean, it's more or less reached steady state. But between those, now if you look at the post World War II history of OECD, EU, European GDP growth, the two big arithmetic impulses have been an absolute increase in the number of workers, which has accounted for roughly half of GDP growth, and the other half has come from productivity increase per worker, right? So the growth prognosis for a continent and the broader OECD is rather grim because the population driver has either flatlined or in many cases, including Germany, Japan, etc., has become a drag on growth as the absolute number of workers starts to decline. The second, which is the productivity gains part, I mean, we've long been having the discussion of why productivity has stagnated and so on and so forth. And then unless and until we come to, a new technological age and new, as yet unanticipated drivers of productivity growth, the GDP prognosis is rather grim. And this linking this back to our earlier discussion that at, financial market returns at some point need to be fundamentally linked to GDP
have to reflect
growth,
real
right?
life. Yeah. Exactly.
Right? So we saw returns 6 to 8% that were twice or more compared to, the 3% or so global growth rate. And now as the growth rate within the OECD declines, that's yet another. So just to, add the final arrow that will bring the elephant down, right? I mean, this is yet another thing that's likely to depress financial. Now, so let's talk the sunny, optimistic story now. After having depressed all your listeners,
yes, please.
Here's the sunny, optimistic story. So for every rich country facing demographic decline, there are at least two developing emerging markets out there that have the opposite problem, that have a structural shortage of capital and a structural excess of people, right? India, which is, one of the most dynamic emerging economies, right, is not able to generate productive employment opportunities for the 12 million Indians that come into the workforce every single year, right? So is there a way of employing all of that underutilized human capital in a far, far more productive way that boosts global productivity, global growth, and the profitability of our firms and the returns on our investments? And, arithmetically, the problem is very, very simple, right?
Yeah, you move capital from one place to you move the capital from when there's loads and loads of capital and not enough people. You move it to where there's loads and loads of people, not enough capital, and in so doing, you prevent all the people from that place coming into the richer place. So you kind of stem some social problems that come from immigration, and you actually boost global productivity. Can it be done? We're really out of time. Can that be done?
Well, there is no other way, right? And so let's think of this slightly differently. So climate change is, perhaps the single biggest existential looming threat, and everything else is sort of is noise compared to that.
It's little boy stuff.
Exactly. And what is often not discussed, if you just put yourself in Putin's head, 2021 were horrible years for anybody who was in the fossil fuel industry, right? And they really, really seem to turbocharge what had already been a trend, that the end of fossil fuels, if not in cash flow terms, but in terms of growth markets and the outlook a decade hence was terrible, and this was turbocharged where oil prices turned negative, right? Now here you are, an all-powerful dictator in a country that is, for all intents and purposes, just a fossil fuel exporter, right? I mean, a primary economy pretending to be a developed country.
Yeah, the American put down for Russia is it's a gas station, right?
Yeah. And you're power hungry, and you suffer from, all sorts of complexes in your head, and you want to leave a mark on the world, right? And this was the last hurrah. So one can actually relate the broader trend, mostly driven by the climate discussion of the decline and, the eventual decline in fossil fuels, whenever that might happen, with Putin's last hurrah. How do you make yourself notice? And of course, there was the recovery from the pandemic, and there was a small supply squeeze. And if you're an opportunistic dictator, this would be the perfect opportunity to invade Ukraine. And so I think, geopolitically, clearly the climate discussion is linked to the timing of the invasion and the nature of, the slow throttling of energy flows to Europe. And just going back to this, so now the issue is, 80% of what happens on climate, on biodiversity loss, on ocean acidification, on any of the multifaceted environmental challenges we face will be determined by the actions taken or not taken by emerging economies, right? So emerging and developing economies are systemically significant from an environmental point of view. Whatever you might do at home in the EU is going to be piddling in comparison, right? But 80% of assets under management and many of the critical technologies related to the transition, the EU and the United States are definitely globally systemically significant players, right? So if you just look at it from the EU, are we financially and macroeconomically and technologically relevant to the world? Yes.
Absolutely.
Right? And so the same financial flows that make sense from the perspective of expanding the size of the economic pie, helping develop this human capital, enabling catch-up growth rates. And we all know, in the EU, we are close to the technological frontier. Under a good scenario, Italy might grow at 1%, right? You throw money blindfolded in a country like Nigeria, and in almost any case, it is likely, despite the corruption, to be employed far more productively in expanding the size of the economic pie, right? So just the neat picture is, from the perspective of climate, demographics, stemming migrants that might, upend the social consensus in developing economies, generating profits for our multinationals, or generating returns on assets to allow our pensioners to retire. All of the answers lies roughly in the same direction. As of today, only between 6 to 10% of Western institutional capital is deployed in any developing and emerging economy, right? And as of today, more than half of global GDP and 2/3 of growth, and I think 95% of population growth, all lie in the emerging market. So there is just no other choice apart from redeploying this. The problem is we've got so used to the easy, lazy way of throwing money at the American index, let the policymakers and quantitative easing and central banking put, inflate asset prices and call ourselves financial geniuses. We've forgotten what real capitalism is about. And real capitalism is about hard work, finding productivity enhancing opportunities, and small little opportunities that grow over time. So I'm one of the few people who's, rather than saying we have too many people working in the financial sector, I now say we have too few. We have too many people working on American stock markets. We have next to nobody with the expertise, with the skills, with the connections in developing and emerging economies, who's able to do the hard work, the due diligence, the search function, which is critical to capitalism, to find those investment opportunities at scale. And without that, there is no sensible macroeconomic, environmental, or political path forward for the world.
A tour de force. Suddenly we've chatted over the years, but the way in which you bring that all around. So what we're talking about now, and we're going to close down the discussion, is basically there's such a self-evident and obvious need for a shift of capital from rich countries to poor countries, if nothing else, to help rich countries and poor countries together. And maybe, just maybe, the end of this 3-decade-long support for what you would kind of financialization, the casino, may well be the moment where we say, hold on a second, let's park that. That game's over. But there's a new game, and that new game is actually could benefit all of us. It's like a new Bretton Woods almost in terms of thinking about the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the world has mercifully passed peak financialization, and this is, the real economy biting back. You could say, this is arithmetic biting back. This is, Mother Earth slapping us in the face, saying, "Wake up." Or you could say, this is the real economy. In all cases, the answers lie in the same direction. And maybe one last thing to end on. So, let's look at Norway. Norway has an oil fund, 300% of GDP. So a lot of money in the bank. It still has oil and gas reserves. It has fantastic, physical infrastructure. And yet there was a study done by the Norwegian finance ministry that looked at where does future Norwegian wealth come from, right? Just a sort of simplistic study. And that study concluded that roughly 80% of future Norwegian wealth came from human capital, right? Now, imagine a country like, Nigeria or India, crappy infrastructure, right? Almost, Nigeria's got some oil in the ground, which will probably become, worthless by the time they get their act together. India is rather, poorly endowed in natural resources, and neither of them has any money in the bank, right? All they have is people. And yet, right, human capital throughout the history of modern capitalism has been the single best endowment we've had. Technology does a supporting function, and just the sheer injustice, madness, and unfairness, just morally repugnant outcome of all these aspirational people, many of whom could do your job and my job, much better than us, but just have accidentally been born in different places. And imagine what they would do, right? If they got the chances that you and I have had, if they got a chance to develop their capital, get a chance to go to school, to university. So I think, for the human race as a whole, there is a very good future, despite climate and everything else, that awaits us if we are able to harness that human ingenuity. And it is a crime against humanity and ourselves and our children that we are completely failing to do that.
Sonny, we will leave it there. Such a brilliant way to end. As always, it's a pleasure. And let's talk again. We will come back to the housing, but the housing is profoundly insignificant in comparison to the note that we've just ended on. So talk to you soon. Wonderful stuff.
Cheers. Thank you, my friend. Speak soon.
Mac, Sonny was just amazing there. Like as you said earlier, he just ties everything together. But there's so much in that it deserves its own podcast. So maybe we should come back to it. We have stuff to like the valuation effect I thought was really interesting, and the kind of movement of capital that he was talking about, and his optimistic view of financing the future economy. So maybe, Mac, if you're in agreement, we'll come back to this on Tuesday and unpack it.
We will definitely unpack it. No, listen, unless I am taken captive here by the local hard shots, I will.
Mac.
Well, I'm telling you, you see fellas walking around with Kalashnikovs and big, Hezbollah T-shirts, and you're saying, okay, maybe I should actually take the camera crew the other side of the street. So listen, what we'll do is, if I get out of here, which I think I will, obviously, I'll be back home in a couple of days' time. So let's do that. Let's just basically go back, take the ideas Sonny was talking about, and tease them out a little bit more.
Perfect.
Okay?
Great.
Talk to you Tuesday. Now, while I have you, it's the summer. You've got a choice. You can sit in your Swiss, hang out, do nothing, have a few pints, take it handy, or you can use the summer to learn economics with me on Patreon. We have 2 courses, the courses that I give in Trinity, macroeconomic courses, cycles, booms, busts, history, the history of money, all sorts of good stuff, right? We've got the notes, we've got the reading list, we've got everything. We'll take you through it. A very fine way. If you're going out for a stroll, just put the headphones in and listen and learn economics with me. That's economics with me, patreon.com/David McWilliams.